Hello chess fans. Magnus Carlsen is arguably the most difficult opponent to prepare for because he is a master of so many different openings. However, there is one opening he seems to always come back to, and how can you blame him? He is unstoppable with the Catalan Opening. Here are 3 games where he crushes top grandmasters using his commanding Catalan Opening. Stepping onto the board for the first game is the formidable Dutch titan Anish Giri. Magnus starts d4 and the reply is knight f6, then c4, e6, and knight f3, avoiding the Nimzo-Indian defense. Black's d5 stakes a claim in the center before Magnus unveils the Catalan Opening with g3. In the Catalan, white combines the space-gaining moves d4 and c4 of the queen's gambit with g3, preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop. This places pressure mainly on the queen side while hoping to keep the white king safe in the long term. Black continues bishop e7, preparing to castle, and Magnus fianchettos the bishop. Then both sides castle. Black takes the pawn, unwittingly empowering white's light-squared bishop with increased scope on the long diagonal. There are a number of ways for white to chase down the rogue pawn, but Magnus chooses knight a3. This has the added benefit of preventing b5 and the drawback that it can be captured, which it is. The knight falls prey to black's bishop, severely damaging white's pawn structure. Yet the position will start to open up, which favors white's unopposed bishop pair. Black develops the bishop to d7, readying to contest the long diagonal. Magnus answers with a4, gaining some space on the queen side and opening the doorway for his dark squared bishop. As anticipated, we see bishop c6 contesting the long diagonal and bishop a3 attacking the black rook. Black only has the one move, rook e8. Magnus commences the hunt for the c-pawn with queen c2. Black rolls out knight b to d7, weaving a trap. The plan would be to meet queen takes c4 with knight b6 forking the queen and pawn. Magnus, ever vigilant, chooses rook a to c1, activating one of his rooks with a clever idea that we'll see shortly. Black plays a6, preparing to reinforce the c-pawn with b5. So Magnus captures the pawn before it's too late, resulting in knight b6 forking the queen and pawn. White's queen coyly steps to c3, seemingly inviting black to take the pawn, and indeed black does so, attacking the queen. White shifts the queen to b3. Black plays queen d5 with the goal of trading queens now that he's up a pawn. In this critical moment, Magnus reveals his ingenious idea. Rook takes c6. The immediate effect of this move is removing the defender of the knight so that black cannot take back with the pawn. He cannot exchange queens either because then the knight would be hanging and there's no time to recapture the rook. Black's sole option is to capture with the queen. Despite being down an exchange and a pawn, Magnus's sacrifice is of purely positional nature, meaning there is no quick way to regain the material. However, he can now park his knight on e5, attacking the queen twice. White's powerful knight and a bishop slicing the board in half, combined with immense pressure on the queen side, creates a formidable position. Meanwhile, black's knight on h4 is in no man's land. Black attempts to exchange queens with queen b5, but Magnus resists, maintaining the queenside pressure. Black responds with knight d5, defending the c-pawn. White's rook swoops to b1, forcing the queen to her only available square, a5. Even though white's down material, it's becoming a little more clear that white's in the driver's seat. In a slightly counterintuitive but potent move, Magnus eliminates black's best piece with bishop takes d5. Although it trades white's influential bishop, it grants white unparalleled control of the queenside. Black can't recapture with his queen because it would hang the knight, so he has to recapture with the pawn. Then white grabs the b-pawn and attacks the c-pawn. Black pushes c5, undermining the defense of the knight. Magnus responds with the mighty queen f5, casting a shadow of checkmate over black. Black could throw in queen e1, but this achieves nothing other than putting the queen further from the defense of her king. So rook f1, defending the f-pawn. White still takes it with the knight since there were 3 attackers. Then black plays the fancy move, queen d8, exploiting the pin on the knight and planning to go to f6 next. White, on the other hand, seizes another pawn, creating a valuable passed pawn. When black tries to exchange queens, Magnus, now even in material thanks to his pawn advantage, accepts. After black recaptures, a swift knight h6 check follows. King h8, the only move, is met with c6, pushing the c-pawn to glory. Rook c8 is briskly met by c7. Knight c3 goes after the e2 pawn, and Magnus counters with the cunning bishop b2. If black captures, then king f1 not only traps the knight, but sets the stage for a lethal bishop takes f6 checkmate. Instead, black plays d4 to secure his knight. White continues knight f7 check, king g7, and knight d6, putting the rook in jeopardy. Black will lose the exchange back, and there's nothing he can do about it. He plays king g6. Magnus follows suit, activating his king in the endgame. Knight b5 attacks the pawn, forcing white to finally capture the rook, which black recaptures. a4 dislodges black's knight, causing it to capture the c-pawn and abandon defense of d4. White wins the d-pawn. The final two moves of the game are knight e6 and bishop e3. There may not be an immediate victory in sight for white, but black acknowledges the inevitable. Down 2 pawns in the endgame against the likes of Magnus Carlsen, reputedly the greatest endgame technician of all time, black resigns. Next on the battlefield for Magnus is the spirited American grandmaster Samuel Sevian. The game unwinds just like the previous ones, but this time black releases the tension in the center, choosing to grab the dangling pawn at the first chance. Magnus continues his development, fianchettoing his light-squared bishop, and black challenges white's center with c5. White does not take the pawn because not only would black develop his bishop by recapturing, he would first exchange queens, stealing white's right to castle. So white opts for safety and castles, while black continues to exert pressure on the d4 pawn. Magnus plays knight a3, relinquishing the d4 pawn to win the c4 pawn in exchange. This is a clever idea, given the perpetual weakness of the pawn on d4, which can't be defended by e5 with white's firm grip on that square. Dislodging the knight seems equally perilous, as it would seriously weaken the long diagonal ripe for exploitation by white's light-squared bishop. In response, black plays bishop f5, fortifying his extra pawn, while Magnus sketches out a3, hatching a plan to boot out the bishop with b4. a5 puts an immediate stop to that plan, but it also creates some seriously weak squares on black's queenside. White plays b3, supporting the knight and paving the way for the other bishop. Black castles, and white plays bishop b2, adding a third attacker to the d4 pawn. Black plays queen c7 with the idea of meeting knight takes d4, which is what white plays, with rook d8 pinning the knight to the queen. However, this was a minor misstep. This pin would be troublesome for white if not for this one clever resource that Magnus finds. The move is knight b5. Exploiting the weak queenside squares, the knight launches a counterattack on black's queen. Black shouldn't exchange queens because it would give white a slightly more active position. Instead, black saves his queen, and so does white. Now, yearning to develop his last minor piece into an active role, black plays e5, opening the diagonal for his bishop. Magnus challenges the open d-file, and black develops the bishop to g5. White plays h3, a useful move to create loose for his king, and black retreats the bishop with the target square of g6 in mind. White exchanges one pair of rooks, and after black recaptures, immediately challenges the d-file once again. Bishop g3 hits the queen, but white interposes rook takes d8 check first, and black recaptures with the queen. Magnus plays queen d2, offering a queen exchange, which black accepts. White recaptures with his knight, ushering the game into an ostensibly equal endgame. But this is Magnus Carlsen's home turf, where he excels at meticulously crafting an advantage out of thin air. Black starts with bishop c2, forcing white's knight to stay put, defending the b-pawn. Magnus plays e3, blunting the bishop's diagonal. King f8 begins activating the king. Then white returns the knight to c3, and it seems like he could play knight e4, hitting the bishop. black preemptively retreats to a7. But that wasn't why Magnus played knight c3. His next move is surprisingly capturing the knight with his bishop. Black recaptures, and had the knight been on b5, it would be attacked. In this position, on the other hand, white has the time to play knight c4, forking 2 pawns. Black could try taking the b3 pawn, but knight takes a5 forks the bishop and the c pawn. Bishop d5 wouldn't work because white would take it, opening up an attack on the e pawn. White would still win a pawn. Back to the game, black plays knight d7 to defend the e pawn, and Magnus wins the a pawn. Black plays bishop b6, forcing the knight to leave the defense of b3, and it captures the c pawn. In response, black takes on b3 and is only down 1 pawn. Now, what do you do when you're up a pawn in an endgame? You march it down the board, of course. a4. In anticipation of a5, black plays bishop c5. Magnus presses on, undeterred, inching 1 step closer to queening his pawn. Bishop c4 provides a temporary halt to white's parade. With knight e5, white puts the bishop under fire. It retreats to e7, so that after white captures it, black can recapture and in doing so bring his king closer to the action. Bishop a3 check is followed by king e6, then knight d6 attacking the bishop. It blockades the pawn by going to a6. Magnus plays knight e8, threatening both knight c7, winning a piece, and to simply take the pawn on g7. With 2 threats hanging in the balance, black can only defend 1. And so, just as in the previous game, recognizing the futility of fighting against Magnus Carlsen 2 pawns down in an endgame, black acknowledges his impending defeat and resigns. As the curtains rise for the final act of this grandmaster spectacle, Magnus Carlsen faces off against the formidable Chinese grandmaster Wang Hao. Black plays bishop e7, and white fianchettos the bishop before both sides castle. Then black takes the pawn, and just like the first game, white plays knight a3 going after the c pawn. Black chops the knight off the board, decimating white's pawn structure. Black's bishop d7 is followed by a4, opening the square for white's dark squared bishop. Black challenges the long diagonal with bishop c6, and Magnus attacks the rook with bishop a3. Rook e8 is followed by queen c2 attacking the c pawn. Knight b to d7 indirectly defends the c pawn with the idea of meeting queen takes c4 with knight b6. Magnus plays rook a to c1, and if you've been paying attention, this game follows the first one exactly up until this point. In the first game, black played a6. This time, black plays bishop d5, creating a sturdy construction to defend the c pawn. White continues rook f to e1, and this move has a deep plan. Just to illustrate it, suppose black played h6. Then white would play e4, followed by bishop f1, which would win the c4 pawn and give white great control of the center. And were black to play knight b6 to defend the c4 pawn, white could just kick it away with a5. Going back to the game, white's potential plan explains black's next move. a5 wards off the threat of a5 from white, thereby allowing black to safely play knight b6 to defend the c pawn. In this subtly altered landscape, e4 loses its glamour as the pawn would transform from an asset to a liability. Not only would it be difficult to defend, but it also blocks white's light squared bishop. So as if he had mouse slipped his last move, Magnus shifts his rook over 1 square again, defending the d4 pawn, which allows the knight to move around more freely. Black fortifies his center with c6, and white's knight springs to e5. Black exchanges bishops, white recaptures, and black's knight goes to b6, eyeing the juicy square on d5. Magnus foils that idea with e4. Knight d7 strives to eliminate white's dominant knight. So white finally wins back the c pawn. Black grabs the knight and white recaptures. Black's knight on d7, having completed its duty, returns to f6, attacking the e4 pawn. In lieu of e5, which would be a welcome sight for black as it creates a backward d-pawn and a great outpost square for the knight on d5, white plays f3 to defend. Black's queen gingerly steps to c7, opening up a lane for his rook. Magnus plays rook b1, targeting the b7 pawn. Rook d8 is followed by queen b3 with the imminent threat of taking on b7. Black plays rook d7 to defend while still keeping his rook active. White, in a bid to optimize his forces, plays bishop c1, intending to relocate the bishop to the king side where it can plague the black queen. Black plays c5, aiming to neutralize white's central pawn duo. But this is a small mistake. Magnus plays bishop f4, hitting the queen. She has to cling to the c-file to protect the pawn, so queen c6. Then rook c1 attacks and pins the pawn to the queen. b6 defends. Magnus captures the pawn, opening the d-file. This prompts black to exchange rooks, and after white recaptures, black takes back the pawn on c5 with his queen. Quick as a viper, Magnus strikes the queen with bishop e3, forcing it back to c6. Now white shouldn't be too hasty with taking the pawn. An overeager queen takes b6 allows queen c2 check, which would win the a4 pawn. And an equally tempting bishop takes b6 might have to grapple with an annoying rook b8, pinning the bishop. Magnus, cool as a cucumber, opts for the safest path. Queen b5, striving to exchange queens and repair his fractured pawn structure. Black evades the exchange, playing queen c3, hitting the bishop. Rook d3 defends and counterattacks. Then queen c2 check is met by rook d2. The queen returns to c3 and white defends his bishop with his king. Black defends his b-pawn with his rook. Magnus offers another exchange with queen d3. At this point, black would have been prudent to accept the offer. Though white's pieces would have been slightly more active and the bishop would hold the upper hand over the knight in an endgame scenario with pawns on both sides of the board, black's prospects of holding a draw were promising. Instead, black retreats the queen all the way to c8. This allows Magnus to take the b6 pawn. Black cannot recapture because the back rank would be left vulnerable and queen d8 would lead to checkmate. Queen b7 attacks the bishop and queen d4 defends, again taking advantage of the weak back rank. This prompts black to play h6, giving his king luft before white wins yet another pawn. In a desperate bid for counterplay, black's queen attempts to hunt the white king with queen b1. But Magnus, unfazed, safely tucks his king on g2, stopping any infiltration. Queen c1 readies the rook for an incursion on the back rank. In response, white plays queen c3, trying to get rid of black's queen. Queen b1 is met with queen c2. Black keeps the queens on the board with queen b7. Magnus's relentless queen trade offers continue, and black avoids it once again. The final tactical combination is a sight to behold. Magnus's queen audaciously captures the rook. Black recaptures, and the final move of the game is rook d8. Black resigns since the resulting endgame is hopeless. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.